in another case that I tried on behalf of farm workers, didn't directly involve the union, a case called Leduc versus Nelson. And this was a case that went on for years and years and involved what were called farm and ranch checks by the Border Patrol. And the background of this case goes back a long while. I mean, we had always heard about these labor camp raids by the Border Patrol. And but we'd never really found anybody who'd experienced one. And there was one of these raids at Dave Wyckoff's labor camp in the Yakima Valley. It was near Prosser, Washington. And what would happen is that the Border Patrol would go into these labor camps, usually like 4 or 5 in the morning, rouse people out of their cabins, ask for their papers, and if they didn't have papers, they would arrest them, and they'd be deported soon thereafter. And this was another thing that was really intimidating to workers, was that because the majority of the workforce in the Yakima Valley were undocumented aliens. They did not have papers. And this was a situation where the growers and the workers were basically on the same side. And it was one of the few situations where we were on the same side, because the growers obviously had an economic interest in keeping a stable workforce. And if they all of a sudden lost their labor force, they're going to lose their crop. And we were able to start this case because Evergreen, in its outreach, learned of a fellow named Charles Leduc, who was an Anglo and was certainly a United States citizen. I think he was born in Wisconsin. He was working as a farm worker during, I think, the summer of 1977. And he was living in a tent. And early one morning, Border Patrol shows up where he was and shines a flashlight into his tent and says to him, and this is his testimony, "Buenos dias, señor." And he says, "What? Who's this?" And his response is, "Buenos dias, my ass. What do you want? What are you bothering me for?" And so they backed off, and somehow Evergreen staff found Leduc, who was pretty upset about this treatment. So we started a lawsuit, initially a class action, with him as the only named plaintiff. And later on, 2 other plaintiffs were added, Carlos and Consuelo Garcia, and they had been citizens, and they were rousted out of their bed in a totally different incident several years later. But this case involved proof of hundreds of labor camp raids over a period of 4 or 5 years. And we tried it in Spokane in 1982 or 83, and won at the trial court level with a terrific opinion by the federal district judge. And then it was appealed by the government to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and there was a terrific opinion in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals enjoining the Border Patrol from conducting warrantless raids in labor camps. They never got search warrants or arrest warrants or anything, because they never had any specific information. And we found that they had a system of just going around and checking without any specific information, going into private property, into labor camps, and arresting people, because they knew, based on past experience, that there would be a lot of undocumented aliens there. But the whole concept of the Fourth Amendment is that the government is prohibited from conducting unreasonable searches and seizures. And the history of that litigation has always been that there's a special place of privacy in the home. And these were these people's homes. And when you think of it, there's how this existed without any real fundamental challenge for years and years is hard to explain, because you can imagine if you had the Seattle police going into private homes in the Seattle area, waking people up at 4 in the morning and demanding, you know, the reaction to that type of tactic would be just, you know, would be outrage, and it would never be tolerated. But, and I don't mean to engage in any kind of racial or cultural stereotypes here, but I think it was agreed by all of us who were involved that the undocumented farm worker community who were from Mexico were very differential to authority. They would not challenge the Border Patrol in any kind of verbal confrontation or otherwise. And we actually elicited some testimony from some of the Border Patrol agents at the trial in this case that that was in fact the case. That their perception is that these workers would be very compliant. They would not resist. They would not resist by any physical action. They would just, you know, they would submit to questioning. They would just look at this as part of their existence. And I mean, the judge made a finding about that this population was did have that characteristic, and so they didn't need, you know, I mean, the fact that there wasn't warrants were just, it had never been challenged. And you know, that case resulted in a revision of the way the Border Patrol conducted itself nationally in agricultural areas. So it had major national impact.